diversity of the species of the trees that are planted, and the health of the trees, increasing soil moisture and quality through composting and distribution of that compost to the local tree beds. This is an application for specifically for street trees. In New York, we did a little research, found that 90% of the trees in the city are not street trees, meaning not the ones that are on the corner of the sidewalk, but that means they must be in parks. So when we're talking about maintaining trees that are on the street, that's one thing, but that's not to miss the bigger picture, which is the massive quantity of trees that are absorbing carbon and dealing with pollution are going to be in your concentrated areas, your parks. So one thing we talk about is not expecting trees to solve all the problems of carbon and pollution that are happening, when a lot of addressing the problem is going to be at the root source. One example would be development. So one of the problems in the city, specifically New York, is warehousing of apartments, new development being used as a way to address problems of housing shortages, when we have plenty of housing in giant apartment buildings that are just sitting empty because of a very twisted incentive model that means that building owners are incentivized to keep those apartments off the market. So we're building new buildings, and we have plenty of housing available, buildings that have already been built, so we can't expect trees to solve carbon footprint problems that are the result of these twisted incentive models. So address the root source. For the tree volunteer programs, a lot of the data you probably see if you looked at the tree data is entered by volunteers. The tree census that was done in 2015, a lot of that is people, everyday people, just downloading an app, volunteering to go measure trees in their neighborhood and going out and saying, I see a tree, I'm going to take a picture of it, I'm going to enter the data. And little by little, that's a lot of the entries in the 700,000 records of street trees that are in that massive public data set. So increasing the tree volunteership and stewardship programs. We have all noticed that trees that are planted on the street may or may not survive. So they may have a barcode and a tag, and say they were planted pretty recently, but you may be looking at a dead tree, and that may be the second or third iteration for that particular tree bed. That means there's a stewardship problem. That means the person, the ownership of who's supposed to be taking care of that tree is either not clear or not enforced. So you got to improve that. Direct city resources to concentrations of the trees in the parks. It may be that it's better to direct a particular resource towards maintaining the health of a gigantic old tree in a park or a cemetery, for example, versus using those same resources to plant a new tree, which may or may not survive due to the stewardship problem. And tree data sets should be public and updated. New York's got a great, the tree data that exists now is a great model to begin with, but we also noticed that the dates on the data set were all from 2015, 2016, meaning that's when the original census was taken. Unclear when we look at, like, let's say something that should be updated, like the diameter of that tree today, if that entry in the database is from 2015 or if that's from today, that should be clear in the data set too. That's something that could be improved. Other things in the data set, like being able to understand from the public's point of view what the carbon sequestration capacity is for a particular tree species in particular soil types, in particular stage of growth. That would be all very valuable, I think, for the public to be able to look at. Last thing I'll mention is we looked at, just as a comparison, for what is the capacity of trees to sequester carbon versus the whole carbon footprint of New York City. It's many orders of, it's at least a couple order of magnitude in terms of difference. In other words, the capacity for trees to sequester carbon is less than 1% of the carbon footprint of the city. That's with a city that's done a pretty good job of planting new trees. So we can't have outside expectations in terms of what trees can be done, but we want to make sure that that program is still successful. And that's our group.
Raise your hand if you're a tree.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we want to go like counterclockwise, like this, and just move that.
just I guess to first show off what we did, we kind of generated a map just using the data and the longitude and latitude to show off like where the trees are, and you can zoom in and it shows where all the trees are. The data does not include park trees, so that's why Central Park doesn't look like it has any trees. Yeah, and then we also use the NTA codes to kind of map the tree health of trees like by MTA, so like kind of sub-regions in New York, and also the tree density. So that's kind of what the interactive map shows on a high level, but more granularly and showing like the specific measurements of tree density. We show that here. And generally from our findings, one interesting thing was that there are actually no street trees around Midtown. If you see around here, I don't know if everybody can see that. I'll try to zoom again. But yeah, there are no street trees. But when you map that against like a population map, just from the government or something, that's actually where the highest pollution is, which makes sense because the more touristy areas are around Midtown, Times Square area, and that's where the highest pollution is, and it's also where less trees are because you don't have the area to put the trees. And generally from our just discussions, we kind of want there to be, wanted to create a map of tree density and health, show off those tree locations and the NTA scale data, and also use that against the upcoming 2025 NYC tree census to kind of extrapolate trends, see where proper allocation for funding of trees and resources should be put, for example, in these more polluted areas where trees are lacking. And yeah, we didn't get to go too far in depth. There's a lot more research that we want to do after the 2025 census data comes out, though. Yeah.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Rishabh. There's Ethan from our team, Madi, and Mike was filming all of us. So what we did is we started with thinking about how we can use time series data. So every decade is recorded. 2005, there's 95, and there's 2015 as well. So the only thing is the number of fields that were captured every decade have kind of increased, right? Because of the level of complexity. So we went into time series to see, okay, how has the health of a tree declined in every decade, right? We kind of hit into a wall with that because the tree IDs changed. So we said, okay, let's abstract it one more level and go into a neighborhood, right? So finally, the data that we could, kind of analyze, and we also got a nice visualization, which I'll show you all, is basically for every neighborhood, right? We kind of got what's the average tree health based on the health that is being captured by the people who recorded this data, and also what's the average tree count in that neighborhood. So the neighborhoods, thankfully, have stayed the same, and they've been very consistent over the last 20 years. So yeah, we got some interesting stats. I want to call out a couple of things. 2005, Battery Park, Lower Manhattan, and Central Harlem had like the highest tree health and a good amount of tree count. So they were probably the top two precincts to be healthy, I would say, in terms of tree health. But 2015, it's changed, and it's Hudson Yards and Chelsea, and it's Upper West Side in terms of the average health and the number of trees. So that's an interesting statistic. One flaw or like a risk that I may be kind of missing out is 2005, as many trees may not have been recorded, maybe just because of lack of human resources. So that's one thing. And then finally, we kind of put all of that on a visualization. I know it's a small screen, but basically these are all the different precincts or the neighborhoods, right? So if you see, this is a good sign, which is average tree count in every precinct has increased, right, from 2005 to 15. And if you look at the health, it's kind of remained the same, depends on precinct to precinct, so you can really understand, okay, which precinct has done well, versus which is not. So that's an interesting insight we got. So our whole final idea was to really create a precinct report card. So yeah, like every precinct has a tree report card, and it tells you, okay, yeah, it basically focuses on, okay, what's the performance of your precinct from the last, decade, and how has it been doing, what are the goals you should set. You spoke about sequestration, so all of those things, right? how you're performing as a neighborhood, because people generally associate themselves with their neighborhoods a lot more than actually the borough itself, right? And yeah, and for simplicity of this exercise, we just took Manhattan data, because all 5 boroughs was a lot of information set up. But yeah, thanks.
You can have more people up there.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever your group chooses to do is cool.
Hi everybody, this is Shubhan Shubham here. We wanted to not only limit ourselves to the tree data that we had, we also wanted to use the other data sets. We figured out that in the NYC open data, we have data about the traffic, automated traffic, the traffic which is taken by the automated traffic cameras all around the neighborhood. And we also found out that there is a good amount of data related to the air quality index of the entire NYC city, and we wanted to create a heat map and overlay all the 3 data sets together and to figure out how the most congested areas in the city and the least congested areas in the city are impacted the health of the trees in the city, and how that is in turn impacting the air quality. And this is what our idea was. We didn't have much time to figure out the entire data set, but Varun can talk more about what the insights are.
Yeah, so what we basically did was we first took just the tree data set and now we overlaid it based on 3 factors of the tree health, like just one factor, and red, yellow, and red, orange, and red. Green, orange, sorry, I'm colorblind, so I can't really figure out, but it's green, orange, and red based on the tree health, and yeah. So the major insight was when we overlay the tree health data along with the traffic data, we can see that the areas which have a higher traffic volume passing throughout the day, just like the whole 59th Street Columbus Circle area, it doesn't really have that many trees. So that is something that can be improved. And secondly, Midtown has a lot of trees which are either dead or are in a very bad situation. So we might want to work on that. And that is something. So if we get a better, we had more time, we would also want to overlay the AQI dataset, but unfortunately the data was a bit different, so it took me some time to figure that out. We don't really have time.
But a surprising insight which I would want to share here is, just by looking at the data, because we couldn't overlay the air quality index on top of the traffic and tree data that we have, but this is something which I could see from the data set that we had was just near the Roosevelt tram terminal. There are very few trees, lot of traffic, and very bad air quality.
Yeah.
So I mean, we see that the relation, and this is very obvious and intuitive to see that relation, but I guess we can work more on the data and we can figure out the exact impact on the air quality.
Yes.
That's all. Thank you.
Which other groups for trees? All right. Let's give it up for trees.
I got one more here for trees.
Yeah.
So that was based on the 2015 tree census. That means the next tree census is next year. So can I get a show of hands? Who's going to volunteer to be part of the 2025 tree census? No, come on. You know who you are. There we go. Come on. Is that everyone? There we go. Get a little measuring tape. See how many rocks are in the tree roots. Pretty exciting. Rip roaring good time.
All right, raise your hand if you're part of floods. Okay, shall we start?
Yeah,
This side?
we'll start.
All right. And the whole group can come up, or just certain members, depending on what you want.
Should we stand here?
Probably, I think it's nice to go up.
Better there? Okay.
See, I can works well.
Alright. Hi everyone, I'm Parastu, and we've got Melina and Arsh. So, Melina, Arsh. And we worked on this project that we're very excited to share with you. As you see, there's already so much data about the flooding system, but I'm just going to share what we wrote because it's more thoughtful. And then we're going to, the rest of our group, each person's going to share some. Some of the key questions is how might we improve the data set that the NYC Open Data team has today for first responders and New York City residents? That's the first question. How might we improve communication channels between first responders and New York City residents?
with an evacuation mandate especially? And how might we improve communication channels, right, for those who don't need to evacuate? Maybe they want to give their home to someone to stay. And then how do we create better tools and systems to give the people who need to evacuate a place to stay? So we focus on creating a smarter data-driven approach to emergency evacuation by integrating real-time weather, flood, and historical data. And our innovations include targeted communication via mobile alerts, geofencing, coupled with tools that provide live updates on evacuation routes, shelter availability, transportation options. By leveraging these improvements, we can significantly reduce panic, streamline the evacuation process, making the entire system more efficient and resilient. So our goal is to improve the data to predict through the ML model and better prepare NYC residents. So Arsh is going to talk a little bit about what analysis he did, but before he does that, you're going to talk about the data sets. Melina's going to talk about the data sets that are going to improve what is the insights that we have.
Yeah, so for open data, we're looking at the flood vulnerability index, but I thought it would also be nice to just make the data set more robust, because the more data you have, the more you can do with it. So I was looking at a bunch of different data sets that we could potentially use. So some of the things that came up were FEMA. They actually have a flood insurance rate map. So that would be very interesting for insurance companies. We also have we had the Open NYC ones, which were the flood vulnerability, stormwater flood maps, as well as a sea level rise projection. So those three can be definitely used for the NYC use case. And then something that was nice to also incorporate was the NOAA hurricane data set. So just in case, like, as the climate worsens, we can use hurricane data to try to predict and like see how that'll affect the city as well. So yeah, those are the data sets that could be useful for trying to do trying to make our flood prediction tool. And I could give it to Arsh to talk about the deep dive we did into this data set.
Okay, so through some exploratory data analysis, this is exploratory data analysis in Jupyter Notebook, made some deductions. So this is just visualizing the data and like some null values throughout the years. And then if we go to like the data heat map that was created, it's showing some distributions throughout the FSHRI index. And then we can see like how those projections would be created throughout those years. And then I did some correlations, and through that, there's three indexes that there was. There's 2020s, 2050s, and 2080s. So for that FSHRI value through those different indexes of years, I created some correlations in this distribution. So this is just showing a normal distribution for the FEI. So depending on those storm surges, it'll show like the amount of occurrences that could possibly happen of floods throughout those indexes of years. But then something interesting was the storm surge vulnerability over time. So I don't know if you can see that, it's pretty small, but there's coloring. So for blue it's the present, orange it's the 2050s, and then green is 2080s. So we use density plot visualizations. So comparing the present projections to like projections from like the later years in the data set,
And
it
we
shows
realize that there's a lot of missing data,
Yeah,
which is why it looks like
why it
this.
looks like this. But not only that, like it would still be lower than the present, but it's like a broader spread of vulnerability levels. So throughout time, we basically found that it suggests like some future surge risks that would happen later on in the years. And unfortunately, we couldn't deduct exactly why those would happen, but then I made a histogram for the flood vulnerability index. It just represents it, but in a different way. Unfortunately, due to time, I would have just done the exploratory data analysis. We like developed a machine learning model, created an interface to like do like a testing, training data configuration, and try to deduct why exactly those indexes rise when the years to come.
Yeah, and he also mentioned how it would be very useful to come up with better predictions
Yeah.
about the data. So yeah, that was wonderful. We also have some final solutions just to summarize. So in terms of, if you want to just read, we're just going to briefly snap through and then move on. So just to improve the data set, as you heard Luna share, expanding the weather and flood data sources that we have today, improving the data visualizations that exist already, and automating alerts and improving some of the alert mechanisms, whether it's through Amber Alerts or other possible solutions. So if you want to just read through some of those as well.
Yeah, because we were also talking about like maybe using either an app or a web application, depending on what's more accessible to people who are users. And so, in a similar vein, thinking about social media alerts, using geofencing if that's important for people who are engineering. Maybe they don't really know how things are. And so, like having that local knowledge right away is very useful. And then also like implementing two-way communication to confirm that that people who are evacuating have left the area safely.
And yeah, so pretty much to reiterate, something else that came up a lot, and I don't know if you want to just speak to those last few, the creating better tools and systems.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll add something else. So we were also thinking about like API conjunction. So through like using like a weather API for live times, like obviously a lot of correlations between like what the current weather is and then also like flooding happenings. So if you use both those tools in conjunction, like let's say we created a machine learning model through that data, and then we use like an API weather model, you could make more correlation between those, and then like let's say we have like an interface, we could like predict if that flood would happen, where it would happen, depending on like the geographical location and like past flooding. So yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much. I think we just came up with a project vision for where we could go. Thank you.
Alright, we'll go clockwise to find the next flood. Alright. No, we'll go. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Edward. I'm Norm. And so our solution for the flood project was a New York City Surge Safe dashboard, and the name is brought to you by ChatGPT. So the FBI factory is like complicated. I didn't get too much into it, but it includes like a lot of data in that number. So there's like exposure to the hazard, there's the susceptibility to harm from the exposure, and the capacity to recover. So one example we noticed, if you look at like hospitals and fire departments, there's like less of those, less of that infrastructure in areas that are more likely to flood. So what's the need? The dashboard should include like a notice of if you're at risk of the flood, how to get help, how to help, so with volunteering, and then financial support. So things like vouchers to housing, and then help with insurance claims. So we'll go to the dashboard. Yeah, great look at demo.
Oh, I see. Thank you. I'm a station. Yeah, so it's like a search stage. So we have like a map, so like post like embeds the links, so like you can know like if you're like at risk. So yeah, right now we're recording, so here's the map at risk. Because this is having a high number here. Just like it. Yeah. And this emergency help. So like obviously we got like an emergency on 911, but with like a volunteer box. So like we can kind of check on people. They have your person. Yeah, and there's a priority list. So like if you plug your stuff in, like emergency, your name's on there, so like if you're volunteering, you get help out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a big part of this is the volunteering.
Yeah.
As with the tree data, so that's sort of like the main feature that we wanted to highlight.
Yeah. Just like how we would like mobilize or utilize like volunteers to take tree census, we're thinking of doing a similar thing for like flood vulnerability individuals. So like the way we envision this dashboard is that individuals want to volunteer or help out the community to they can go out and like report the data on like all the individuals who might need help in times of evacuation or in times of emergency. Could be anyone from elderly to anyone with a disability or anyone with any accessibility issue. And then they can submit this data onto our dashboard, which is not going to be publicly accessible, hopefully, only to the people that we give access to in the times of emergency. And what this is going to do is it's going to help us mobilize as volunteers to do wellness, welfare check on those individuals when there's a time of evacuation, when there's a flood warning or any type of like tropical weather coming. They can go in and do a wellness check on them through the app or through the dashboard and report on them. And if they need to require any additional help, they can basically call 911 or get the actual first emergency responders on location to get these guys out and into a safer location. And basically, yeah, and just to the dashboard basically helping overall coordination with the volunteers. Like if there's lack of volunteers in a location, we can send out flyers or like notifications to say, hey, we need more people here. Can someone go do some welfare check in this location?
Sort of like providing infrastructure for like community help with the hurricanes like a couple weeks ago. Like all these blogs in
TikTokers in like
yeah
Florida.
in North Carolina, where like most of the help, most of the support is being provided to people in need, are like people who live there and our neighbors. So providing some infrastructure for those people that are tracking them. And of course, like money, that's what really what people need at the end of the day. So for citizens in like high FDI areas, you know, checking if they have insurance, getting a deduction on their plan, or maybe subsidizing, you know, their premium, and then getting help filing claims or between disputes with the insurance companies, and of course, general like financial support from FEMA, so that people who are affected can recover financially.
Yeah, overall, I feel like I'm still volunteering, but I feel like the volunteering, just like people are always saying there's not enough data, the volunteering basically can help us improve the data quality of actual individuals who might need help. The census data and all the other public data, they don't go deep enough, or like not specific enough. So, sweet.
So, hi everyone, I'm Cash, and
Zach.
Jackson.
and we looked at the same flood vulnerability index data set, but one number that we homed in on is the FSHRI number. You may have heard that mentioned. What is it exactly? We dug into a couple of papers that go into the definition of what that is. It's so small, there's no way you can see this. But FSHRI stands for Flood Susceptibility to Harm and Recovery Index. And that takes into account more than just the risk of flooding, but also things like the percentage of elderly population, elderly people living alone, even things like language isolation. So there are a lot of immigrant communities where people may have just not evacuated due to not understanding the warnings. And in some of these papers, you'll see things like the deaths, the residential fatalities happen in areas not where there's the highest risk of flooding, but where the FSHRI, as in elderly people living alone and so on, are the highest. So what we did is we analyzed the data set focusing on a couple of these areas. So we have ChatGPT wrote this one. I assume it's correct. But so this map shows I think a similar visualization to what other teams have been showing. This is the FBI for the various counties, or the various whatever this subdivision is called. I'm not like American, so whatever geometrical shape this is. But something that's really interesting that we looked into is what are the areas which have the largest change in flood vulnerability from now to 2018? Because these are the areas where we think less attention is being given, and we need to do some work in these areas, and we have some more, we have some interventions we have in mind that we're going to talk about. Just a last note on some of the data sets we didn't manage to incorporate. So there's the census data, which we looked at, which includes things like, a more detailed look into elderly population and that kind of thing.
And the population density of those areas.
Yes. And the storm events database is something that's been used in all of these papers we looked at. but we didn't manage to incorporate that. The storm events will change over time as well. It's targeting of those locations. So I will hand off to one of you.
So you can go more on visual solutions.
So basically, what the ideas that we thought of is that when he was talking about like the immigrant communities in New York City, so a lot of the areas with increased risk of flood, so that would include like areas like around Brighton Beach. There's like a lot of Russians, and South Bronx, where there's a lot of Hispanic people. So we're thinking that we could create like radios, and that the radios would have translations with you know, Spanish, Russian, and all kinds of languages. So it could be like inclusive, and people are more likely to, you know, listen to something that, you know, they feel like safe with. And also another idea that we came up with is that we could increase the amount of first responders in these areas, and vehicles that could take seniors, because like seniors that, you know, can't really like help themselves, so like, you know, like people in wheelchairs, people that need help, like assistance with walking, and yeah.
Yeah, so going off of that, these people that might need assistance getting out of their homes, we have ideas of maybe possibly building like flood bunkers in densely populated areas that are vulnerable to floods, that can maybe carry, you know, cart these people off to these bunkers, or just getting them there, maybe building a bunker maybe every half mile, every mile in these densely populated areas. Some other ideas we had were improving the drainage system in these areas, whether it be increasing the size of the catch basins and giving more time for people to respond, just because our focus was how do we increase the time for people to get to safety wherever it may be. So increasing the drainage system, or making some more porous like roads, or parts, just because it increases the amount of time for water to drain away for people to get out. And one other idea we had was offering free emergency training, flood training protocols, just whether it be in the parks on the weekend, where you know, incentive, people get a free birthday kit or lunch, and then people may better understand what to do when it comes to flood, because I don't know about you, but living in New York, we don't get as worse of flood as many other people, so I wouldn't know what the first reaction might be to do in response to like really bad floods. And figuring out and getting these training, free access to like people would, I think, help understand what to do in case of a flood. Yeah, that's everything.
Hi everyone, I'm Gabby.
And Manthan.
And what we focused on with flooding, kind of explain our thought process, is like, what is one of the biggest issues of flooding? And it's like transportation. How do people get to safety, get out of the area? We considered different topics like commercial vehicle transport, or like taxi zones, or other areas, but I think we all know like the subway is one of the crucial pieces that people use in New York City. And we've all seen those videos on TikTok of like the flooding that's happening in the subways, and has really old infrastructure. So we were thinking like, what can we do around that problem? And we kind of learned about like from Sandy and Ida, like that is a key kind of point of, you know, issue. And yeah,
go into that. So one thing that I saw when researching Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was that there was a lot of problems with subway functionality. They actually spent $5 billion like waterproofing and improving resiliency for things to be able to handle water in the subway systems. And then during Hurricane Ida, there was more flooding, and I think they were shored up in a lot of ways, but they had so much water on the street level that was actively pouring in. So even if the subways are like resilient to water from, you know, underground or whatever, it's like literally pouring in from the top. You can only do so much. So that's what we learned about the resiliency and what was done in the past.
Yeah, and completely changing the infrastructure is really costly. So we're thinking of, okay, what are methods that are a bit easier to integrate, less costly? So I can go over one, you go over the other one.
Yep.
So we were proposing more of like a real-time integrated adjustable water pump system, because a flooding based on the vulnerability index affects different areas differently, of course. So how can we help pumps that are severely affected kind of mitigate and pump out water versus other pumps that are not as affected? So there are a bunch of startups in this space. One of them we would recommend is called Opti, and they kind of use real-time weather data to indicate, okay, which pumps are going to be affected at what time, so we can kind of tell which ones to work harder at what stages. And this also kind of reduces energy usage. If we're smarter about kind of like the pump infrastructure, that definitely kind of helps out with the process. And it's not necessarily adding in brand new pumps. It's more of kind of using the IoT kind of infrastructure to make pumps more effective.
Yeah, so along with installing all of these pumps, we also recommend, and again, the other team just touched upon this, we recommend having around these key entrances permeable pavements and rain gardens, which will help absorb a lot of rainwater before it reaches to these pumps. In a way, it helps to reduce the workload on these pumps and help manage flat floods quickly. Another thing, what we recommend is underground retention basins beneath these green spaces and the permeable pavements that I've just mentioned right now. This could temporarily store runoff water and give pumps some time to clear excess water during high rainfalls. So, yeah.
And our theory for the mechanism by which this would be enacted is that New York government groups who are maybe dealing with, hey, we have this solution, but it's really expensive, can create a call for startups where companies that are just starting out or companies that are trying to create novel technologies around this area can go and build things that are relevant for them. So I think it's just them voicing what they want and what parameters matter to them for them to go buy a system in the future. And hopefully those startups can dramatically reduce the cost or improve the efficacy of the solution and start to make it more palatable for a government scaled up investment.
I think that was already
Okay, flood through.
Let's go further into that. And can I have all the other flood groups raise their hands if you haven't gone yet? You got it. Is this the last one? All right.
So, Yuri, dollars and dollars. G and B. Yeah.
Yes, Alex.
So our solution is kind of smaller, but I think it's easily implementable. We want to help with evacuation in case of floods and help emergency response, both with pre-event, with education, during event to help emergency responders and people, and post-flood to help with supplies and recovery. So the data that we were looking at is the flood vulnerability index, and as one group behind mentioned that the main index that they use is this FSHRI. It's an index that already rolls physical flood data with social factors. In a sense, we want to enhance the data because sometimes indices are good. We think for evacuation that's probably not the best way. We actually want to use the full data set. So we actually want to use the physical indices that they also have with population data, which they have, but strangely enough, they use different indices. So we want to do, as we're doing it, we want to enhance
New York Open Data, who's providing better geographical indices because they use some indices in one data set and some in the other. So,
So like normalizing the actual indices.
yes. So some people use addresses or the names of the neighborhood. Some people use standard geospatial polygons. So we want to normalize it so it's easier to integrate the data. And specifically, we want to, as the first thing, we want to use population data set. So this is the map. As it looks now, we want to integrate it with the population data set. So we'll basically have a joint distribution between the index and population, which is number of people, and it's also broken up by age and first language. So that will create a static data set that basically can be pre-calculated, and then it can be used. So it can be used to plan evacuations. So if we want to send buses and want to plan evacuation, how do we optimize where should we put evacuation centers to get the maximum population that's vulnerable? So that's an optimization, like a simple optimization problem. Since it's static data, it also can be used in planning evacuation routes because you know where those buses will be coming from. So you can optimize sort of movement of the population. Compared to how Google Maps optimize the traffic, you can actually optimize movement of the massive population. So you know, from South Brooklyn, you want to move everyone at the same time, so you don't want to send them all around the same route. So that's a static data. And also static data can be used for education, right? So once we know most vulnerable area, we know their age and primary language, so as somebody else mentioned, we can reach those people and we can provide prior information in their native language, what they should be doing and where, what would be possible evacuation points. And that data, this data can now be combined with the dynamic data, like very precise weather prediction models that can be used in actual planning, and it can be used in simulations for first responders that they can plan for different events and run different scenarios.
So I would just add, a couple of the groups already alluded to this, but the data is kind of missing in terms of its values. So if you look at the data, and I'm talking about the flood vulnerability index data. If you do a drop NI, so if you drop the rows that are missing data, you come down to about 80 rows versus like 2,000. So trying to do correlations, it looks great, but it doesn't really help. So what we were looking at instead was the FSHRI and doing an inner join with the population information and suggesting that the data really has to grow and instead not focus on the other columns, but instead focus on the FSHRI. Something to note about the FSHRI though is that there really isn't any, sometimes it's really helpful to have like qualitative information about why one specific location has a 5 and all the other ones have a 5. And we're talking about like, let's say one point in Manhattan has a 5, but it doesn't have any values. But right next to it, the other columns are filled in and they have 5s. And I'm talking about a 1 to 5, like a Likert scale kind of thing. It indicates that perhaps the FSHRI is really high because other locations nearby are really, really high. And something that we talked about as a group is, right now, for instance, with Hurricane Helene and Hurricane, I'm forgetting the name of it, but with Hurricane Milton, perhaps you live in downtown St. Petersburg, you're at a really high rate or really high likelihood of being flooded. but someone nearby, like 2-3 miles away, is not going to be affected as much so. Nonetheless, the FSHRI is going to be a 5. It's kind of the same thing. And so we wanted to really emphasize that the FSHRI is a really important key thing to look at, regardless of what any of the other rows and columns are telling you. And we need to have an inner join with the population data that is based on the geography of New York City. And Alex, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, actually something that you mentioned is the definition of surge that you brought up, that you're actually comparing this surge data to other reports, and it's like, what are we actually comparing? So I think something, it's just going back to, as we parse the data, having standard definitions for like when we talk about surge, what is surge? How are we measuring surge? That we know it's like apples to apples in terms of looking at the data. And something else I think we talked about was looking at, like, I mean, other groups mentioned this, but using languages in particular areas to make sure that messaging about evacuations, that we're covering the languages. But something I thought of, and I don't know if this is currently what happens when we get messages, is actually storing, you have a link to a message or something like that, but you have multiple translations stored within that, so you can translate the content to whatever language that you speak. So not sure what is the current status quo on that, but that would be interesting, is to having kind of just a better content management system for these kind of emergency notifications and making sure that all the translations are covered.
One thing I want to quickly add is, so during Sandy, a lot of evacuations were actually done or not evacuation, but a lot of the post-Sandy help was done on a week basis. So a lot of Russian groups, I know that because Russian Brooklyn was affected. So that, knowing that information could help with post recovery, because you can organize basically wider help through specific ethnic groups, because they will be going into those areas.
Well, that's everything. Hope everybody enjoyed their time. Glad you're all down to hang out and build stuff. If anybody is particularly interested in NYC open data, whether it's these data sets or something else, who wants to get involved with like submitting something for the March, like some kind of a demo or exhibition in March? Raise your hand if you're like down. Okay, we should like get all of your names and like create some kind of a chat so we can figure out like who's in. So we'll like have a list like over there, and make sure you get your name down if you want to like get involved with that. I think that'd be pretty cool. They said the deadline is November 1st to submit a thing, but I talked to the people at NYC Open Data and they said we could probably flex the deadline a little bit. So like we'll make something work in November probably. But yeah, that's the goal. The next kind of hackathon, we're talking about one in late November to close out the year. And then there's one really cool one planned for January. So join the WhatsApp if you want to stay involved. And yeah, we're just continuing on. Let's take a giant group picture. And we'll take it on these steps on the other side.
There is some help from ChatGPT.